I remember the exact moment my marriage ended. And it wasn't with a fight or a slammed door. It was with a text. "Happy birthday. Babe, I'm stuck at work. We'll celebrate tonight." I stared at the message longer than I should have, letting it sink in like something warm, something safe. For a brief second, I let myself believe him. I let myself believe that the distance between us lately was just stress. Just work. Just life getting in the way. Then I looked up, and everything inside me went still. Andrew stood less than 10 feet away, under the soft glow of the bar lights, his back half turned toward me. The same man who had just told me he was working late. The same man who hadn't touched me properly in weeks. He wasn't alone. His hand rested on a woman's waist like it had always belonged there, like it knew exactly where to go. And before I could even process what I was seeing, before my brain could catch up to the betrayal unfolding in front of me, he leaned in and kissed her. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Familiar? My chest didn't tighten. My heart didn't shatter. It froze. The room around me blurred into something distant and unreal, like I was watching someone else's life collapse instead of my own. The clinking glasses. The low hum of conversation. The polished silver and candlelight. It all felt staged. Like I had stepped into a scene I was never meant to see. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. I didn't feel the movement, just the instinct behind it. I was going to walk over there. I was going to say his name, loud enough for everyone to hear. I was going to make him look at me while his lie unraveled in real time. But a hand wrapped around my wrist. "Don't." The voice was low, steady, too calm for the moment. I turned, my breath catching, and found a woman standing just behind me. I hadn't noticed her before. Mid-40s, maybe, composed in a way that felt deliberate, not natural. Her eyes weren't curious or sympathetic. They were certain. "Not yet," she added quietly. "You don't know the whole truth." For a second, I almost pulled away, almost told her to let go. Because what could possibly be worse than this? What truth could exist beyond watching your husband kiss another woman while lying to your face? But something in the way she said it stopped me. Not dramatic, not urgent. Certain. I slowly sat back down. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table as I forced myself to breathe. One slow inhale, one controlled exhale. Years of working in PR had taught me one thing better than anything else. Timing was everything. The first reaction was never the most powerful one. The right reaction was, I turned my gaze back toward the bar. Andrew hadn't noticed me. That part almost hurt more than the kiss itself. He was relaxed now, his posture loose. Like this version of him, the one with her was the real one. The one I hadn't been allowed to see. The woman with him shifted slightly, and I finally got a clearer look at her. Early 30s. Sharp. Polished in a way that wasn't accidental. She carried herself like someone who understood exactly how she was being perceived and used it. There was something else, too. Something that tugged at the edge of recognition. I couldn't place it. "Watch them," the stranger murmured beside me. I didn't respond. But I did exactly that. Andrew glanced at his watch. Not casually. Briefly. Then again. A few seconds later, his eyes flicked toward the entrance, then across the room, scanning, not nervously, but carefully, like he was checking for something. Or someone. The woman leaned closer to him, saying something I couldn't hear. He nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket. My breath caught again. He pulled out something small, not a gift, not anything wrapped or sentimental, something flat. Discreet. He passed it to her quickly, their fingers barely touching. She didn't smile. She examined it. That was when it shifted. This wasn't just intimacy. It wasn't just betrayal. It was coordination. My stomach turned. But not from heartbreak. From the slow, creeping realization that I had been looking at the wrong thing. The kiss wasn't the story. It was just part of it. "See it now?" the stranger asked softly. I swallowed, my voice barely forming. What is he doing? She didn't hesitate. Something that could destroy you, if you don't understand it first. The words settled into me like a warning I couldn't ignore. I looked back at the woman again, forcing myself to take in every detail this time. The way she held herself. The way she watched Andrew, not like a lover, but like a partner, equal, measured. And then it hit me. Not a feeling. A fact. Her name. I didn't know how I knew it yet. But I did. Lauren. The same name as mine. A strange, hollow feeling spread through my chest as the pieces began to rearrange themselves into something darker. Something colder. This wasn't just betrayal. It was something else entirely. I didn't pull my hand away right away. The stranger's grip wasn't tight, but it was deliberate. Like she knew exactly how much pressure to use to stop me without drawing attention. My pulse was still racing. My instincts screaming at me to stand up, to walk across the room, to make Andrew look me in the eye while everything shattered. Instead, I stayed seated. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice steadier than I felt. She let go of my wrist slowly, like she was testing whether I would still bolt. I didn't. I couldn't. "Not anymore. That's not important right now," she said. "It is to me." Her eyes flicked toward the bar, then back to me. Calm, assessing, like she was measuring how much I could handle. "If you walk over there right now," she said quietly, "you lose everything." I almost laughed. A sharp, bitter sound caught in my throat but never made it out. "Everything," I repeated. "I'm watching my husband kiss another woman 10 feet away. I think I've already lost everything." Her expression didn't change. "No," she said. "You've only seen the part they want you to see." Something about the way she said they, not he, made my stomach tighten. I followed her gaze back to Andrew. He was still standing there, still too comfortable, still too unaware. But now that I was looking differently, really looking, the scene began to shift. He wasn't leaning into her anymore. Not quite. His body was angled slightly away, like he was balancing 2 roles at once. His hand dropped from her waist faster than it should have after a kiss like that. Not reluctantly. Efficiently. And then there it was again. That glance. Quick. Controlled. Scanning the room. Why does he keep doing that? I murmured. More to myself than to her? Because he's not here for her. The stranger replied. I turned to her, my confusion breaking through the numbness. I just saw him kiss her. Yes, she said. And that's the least important thing happening right now. I stared at her. What does that even mean? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the edge of the table, her fingers brushing against the linen like she was grounding herself in the moment. Watch his hands, she said. I did. Andrew shifted his weight slightly, his shoulders tightening for just a second. Then he reached into his jacket again. Slower this time. More careful. He pulled something out. Small. Flat. He passed it to the woman. Not like a gift. Like a transaction. The woman didn't smile. She didn't react the way someone being kissed seconds earlier should have reacted. She looked down at what he gave her, her expression sharpening. Focused. Professional. My chest tightened. That's not, I started, but I couldn't finish the sentence. No, the stranger said softly. It's not what you think. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes back to the woman. Now that I was paying attention, really paying attention, everything about her felt intentional. The way she stood, the way she held her shoulders, the way she spoke to Andrew, low, controlled, precise, not affectionate, strategic. She's not just someone he's seeing, I said, the realization forming slowly, painfully. The stranger shook her head. No. I felt something shift inside me, something cold sliding into place where the shock had been. Then what is she? The stranger studied me for a moment, like she was deciding how much to reveal. Someone he works with, she said finally. Just not in the way you've been told. My mind raced. Work. He said he was working tonight. I looked back at him, my eyes narrowing. "He told me he was at the office," I said. "He didn't lie," she replied. I let out a quiet breath, disbelief creeping in. "He's not at the office." "No," she said. "But he is working?" The words landed differently than I expected. Not comforting. Not reassuring. Worse. I turned fully toward her now, my voice lower, sharper. "You're going to need to explain that." She didn't flinch. "Not here," she said. "And not yet." Frustration flared, hot and immediate. "You don't get to just drop something like that and walk away." Her gaze didn't waver. "I'm not walking away," she said. "I'm telling you to wait." "Why?" "Because if you confront him now," she said, her voice dropping even further, "he adjusts. And once he adjusts, you'll never see what he's really doing." The certainty in her tone cut through my anger. I looked back at Andrew again. He checked his watch. Again, the woman said something to him, her expression unreadable. He nodded. But there was a tension in his jaw now, a tightness that hadn't been there before. He wasn't relaxed. He was managing something. Managing time. Managing risk. My heartbeat slowed. Not because I was calmer, but because everything inside me was focusing. "Who are you?" I asked again, quieter this time. She reached into her coat pocket and slid something across the table toward me. A card. No name. No company. Just a number. And a single word. "Wait." I stared at it, my fingers hovering just above the surface. "When will I understand what's going on?" I asked. She stepped back slightly, already pulling away. "Soon enough," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you need right now." I looked up at her, my frustration mixing with something else now, something I couldn't quite name. Fear. Not of Andrew, not of the woman at the bar, but of whatever this was turning into. She paused for a moment longer, her eyes meeting mine one last time. Then she said quietly, "You think you're watching your husband cheat?" I swallowed. "Aren't I?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're watching something much bigger," she said. "And if you don't see it clearly, it won't just cost you your marriage." She turned and walked away before I could respond. I sat there, the card still untouched in front of me, the word "wait" staring back at me like a command I didn't want to follow. But I didn't move. Not this time. Across the room, Andrew laughed softly at something the other woman said, but it didn't reach his eyes. I could see it now. The calculation, the timing, the way he kept scanning the space like he was waiting for something else to happen. I leaned back slightly in my chair, forcing myself to stay still, to watch, to understand, because for the first time since I saw him, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something planned, and I was already inside it. I left before he ever saw me. I didn't wait for the check. I didn't look back at the bar. I didn't even pick up the card right away. I slipped it into my purse without thinking, like it was something fragile that might break if I stared at it too long. Outside, the night air hit me harder than I expected. Chicago was alive in that quiet, expensive way, cars gliding past, lights reflecting off glass towers, laughter drifting from doorways. It all looked normal. It all sounded normal. Nothing about my life felt normal anymore. I walked without direction for a few blocks, heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that felt too sharp, too loud. My mind kept replaying the same image. Andrew's hand, on her waist. That kiss. But something was different now. The pain wasn't rising the way it should have. It wasn't crashing over me like a wave. It was suspended, held back by something colder, something quieter. I stopped at a crosswalk, staring at the red light, and that was when the thought settled in. If I react now, I lose. It came out of nowhere, but it felt right. Not emotional, not desperate, strategic. The light turned green, but I didn't move right away. I just stood there, letting the realization sink deeper. I had spent years managing crises for other people, controlling narratives before they spiraled, shaping perception before it became reality. And somehow, I had walked straight into a story I wasn't controlling. Not anymore. I crossed the street slowly. My steps measured now. Deliberate. By the time I reached my building, I had already made the decision. I wouldn't confront him. Not tonight. Not until I understood everything. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, waiting for something to break it. I slipped off my shoes, set my purse down, and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. Then I moved. I changed into something comfortable, washed my face, poured a glass of water I didn't drink. Small, normal actions, anchors. By the time the clock hit 11, I was sitting on the couch, posture relaxed, expression neutral, prepared. The door opened a few minutes later. "Hey," Andrew called out, his voice casual, familiar. "You're still up." I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes, letting a soft smile settle into place. "Yeah." I didn't feel like going out after all. He stepped inside, loosening his tie as he walked. Everything about him looked effortless, controlled, like the version of him I had known for years, like the version of him he wanted me to see. "Work ran late," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "You know how it is?" I nodded lightly. "Of course." He moved closer, leaning down just enough to brush a quick kiss against my cheek. "Happy birthday," he added. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, studying him. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no flicker of anything that suggested what I had just witnessed hours ago. If I hadn't seen it myself, I might have believed him. "Thank you," I said. He smiled, satisfied, and walked toward the kitchen. I watched him as he poured himself a drink. His back to me now, shoulders relaxed, movements smooth. Too smooth. "How was your night?" he asked without turning around. "Quiet," I replied. "Yours?" "Busy," he said, taking a sip. "Same as always." Same as always. I almost let that phrase pass. Almost. Instead, I leaned back slightly, crossing my legs, letting my tone stay light. "Busy doing what?" "Exactly." He paused for just a fraction of a second. Then he turned, glass still in hand, expression unchanged. "Meetings," he said. "Nothing interesting." I nodded slowly, like I believed him. "Of course." The conversation drifted after that. Small talk, safe topics, familiar patterns, and I matched him. Word for word, tone for tone, smiling when he smiled, nodding when he spoke, playing my role perfectly. But inside, I was watching everything. The way he kept his phone face down on the counter, the way he checked it when he thought I wasn't looking, the slight delay before answering certain questions. Tiny details, but they added up later. When he finally went to bed, I stayed behind. I waited until I heard the steady rhythm of his breathing from the bedroom before I moved. Then I stood up, slowly, quietly. I walked into the kitchen, my fingers brushing lightly against the counter as I reached for his phone. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward my own laptop, opening it on the table. Shared accounts, shared access, things he never thought to hide. I logged in, my eyes scanning the screen as I navigated through familiar pages. At first, everything looked normal. Bills, subscriptions, routine expenses. Then I saw it. A small transaction. Nothing unusual on its own. But it wasn't the amount that caught my attention. It was the pattern. Same amount. Repeated. Every few days. Sent to an account I didn't recognize. I clicked on it. My pulse steady now. Not racing. Focused. The account name didn't mean anything to me. But the reference line did. Short. Vague. Too vague. I leaned back slightly, my mind already working through possibilities. Then I noticed something else. A second reference. buried in the details. A number that didn't match any of our shared accounts. My eyes narrowed. Another account. Not joint. Not visible. Not mine. I closed the laptop slowly, the screen going dark in front of me. For a moment, I just sat there, the silence pressing in again, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of pieces I didn't understand yet. Full of connections I hadn't made. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the bedroom. Toward Andrew. Sleeping. Peaceful. Untouched by the reality that had already started to unravel around him. And for the first time that night, I felt something close to clarity. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something sharper. Colder. He wasn't just hiding a woman. He was hiding something much bigger. Something structured. Something deliberate. And whatever it was, I was already standing right in the middle of it. I woke up before him the next morning. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I didn't want to. There was a difference. Lying in bed next to Andrew, listening to his steady breathing, I felt none of the things I should have felt. No urge to shake him awake. No need to demand answers. Just clarity. If this was planned, then everything before last night mattered. I slipped out of bed quietly and moved through my usual routine like nothing had changed. Coffee brewing. Sunlight cutting through the windows. The city waking up outside. Andrew joined me 10 minutes later, running a hand through his hair, looking exactly like the man I had trusted for years. "Morning," he said, reaching for a mug. "Morning," I replied. He kissed my cheek. Casual, automatic. I didn't pull away. "You have anything big today?" he asked. "Just meetings," I said lightly. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Same. The word lingered longer this time. I watched him over the rim of my cup, taking in every detail I had ignored before. The ease in his posture, the precision in his tone, the way he never gave more information than necessary. It wasn't distance. It was control. When he left for work, I didn't move right away. I stood by the window, watching him walk down the street, his pace steady, his expression unreadable. Then I turned back inside. If I wanted to understand what he was doing, I needed to stop thinking like a wife. I needed to think like someone investigating a pattern. I opened my laptop and pulled up my calendar. 3 months. That was how far back I went. At first, it looked normal. Meetings, events, deadlines. My own schedule layered with his in ways that used to feel synchronized. Now, I looked closer. Late nights. Repeated. Not random. Same days each week. I cross-checked those dates with the transaction I had seen the night before. The pattern aligned. Exactly. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers still hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't careless. It was structured. I pulled up our shared ride history next. More late-night rides. Locations I didn't recognize. Not near his office. Not anywhere he had ever mentioned. I clicked through one of them, zooming in on the drop-off point. A building downtown. Corporate, not personal. I switched tabs again. Login activity. Devices. Something most people would never check. But I did. Unfamiliar timestamps. Late. Too late for work. Too early for anything else. And the locations didn't match our apartment. Or his office. I exhaled slowly. Double routine. That was what it was. Not lies scattered across time. A system running parallel to the life I thought we shared. I stood up and paced once across the room. Then stopped. This wasn't about catching him. It was about understanding why. I opened my phone and scrolled through old messages. Months back. I watched the shift happen in real time. Shorter replies. Fewer questions. Less presence. At the time, I had blamed stress. Work. Life. Now it felt rehearsed. Deliberate. I closed my eyes for a moment, and a memory surfaced. A few weeks ago, we were sitting at this same table. I had asked him about a transfer, larger than usual, enough to catch my attention. "What's this one?" I had said, turning the screen toward him. He barely looked at it. "Just something from work," he replied, too quickly. "I'll handle it." I remember hesitating, then letting it go. At the time, it felt minor. Now, it felt like a moment I should have held on to. I opened my eyes and moved back to the laptop. If this connected to work, then there would be traces outside of him. I pulled up industry feeds, PR channels, internal updates, anything tied to major developments in the city. It didn't take long. A tech expansion announcement. Quiet, but significant. A company Andrew had mentioned once or twice in passing. I clicked into it, scanning the names associated with the project. Executives, consultants, external advisors. Then I saw it. Lauren. Not me. Her. The same name. The same one that had settled in my chest the night before. My fingers stilled on the keyboard. She wasn't just someone he was seeing. She was inside his work. Inside whatever this was. I leaned back slowly, my thoughts aligning into something sharper. The timing. The distance. The pattern. The transactions. It all started when that deal began. Not before. Not after. Exactly then. This wasn't personal. At least, not in the way I had thought. It was structural. I moved the cursor again, opening a preview of one of Andrew's recent email threads. I didn't fully access it. Not yet. But I could see enough. A subject line. Short. Controlled. Final phase approval. My pulse didn't spike. It steadied. I stared at the words, letting them settle into place alongside everything else. Final phase. Not beginning. Not middle. End. Whatever this was. It was almost done. I closed the laptop gently, the click echoing softly in the quiet apartment. For a moment, I just stood there, the weight of it pressing in. Then I let out a slow breath. This wasn't about a husband betraying his wife. Not really. That was just the surface. What I was looking at was something designed, timed, executed. And I was part of it. Not by choice, but by position. I turned slightly, my gaze drifting toward the empty space where Andrew had been standing earlier that morning. And for the first time, the thought came without hesitation. I wasn't being replaced. I was being positioned. I waited until the apartment was completely still before I opened his laptop. Not because I was afraid of getting caught, because timing mattered. Everything I had seen so far told me one thing: this wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It was structured. And if I moved too fast, if I made one careless mistake, I would tip them off. So I moved slowly, deliberately. The screen lit up in the dark, casting a cold glow across the room. I entered the password on the second try. Not because I didn't know it, because I wanted to feel the rhythm of it again. Familiar. Controlled. The desktop looked exactly the way it always did. Clean. Minimal. Nothing out of place. Too clean. I opened his work folders first, navigating through the obvious directories. Documents. Presentations. Code-related files I didn't fully understand but recognized by pattern. Normal. Expected. Then I slowed down, because if I were hiding something, I wouldn't bury it deep. I would hide it where no one thought to look twice. I scanned the folder names again, this time not reading them, studying them. And there it was. A folder labeled archive_2. Not archive. Not backup. Just slightly off. Enough to blend in. Not enough to disappear. I clicked it. Inside. More folders. Generic names. Project files. Nothing that stood out at first glance. I opened one at random. Empty. Another, also empty. My lips pressed into a thin line. Decoys. I went back and hovered over the remaining folders, letting my instincts guide me instead of logic. Then I clicked the one that felt wrong. No name. Just a date. 3 months ago. The same point everything started shifting. I opened it. Files loaded instantly. Too quickly for something meant to be hidden. My eyes scanned the screen. adjusting, filtering, organizing, documents, structured, labeled, not personal, corporate. The first file I opened had a title that didn't make sense at first. Asset Alignment, Phase 1. I frowned slightly, scrolling through it. Language. Clean. Detached. Strategic. Nothing emotional. Nothing vague. Every line was precise. Every step outlined. I kept reading. And then I stopped. Because I wasn't reading about a business plan. I was reading about a process, a sequence. Step 1. Isolate variables. Step 2. Control narrative exposure. Step 3. Restructure asset visibility. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. Unmoving. This wasn't about romance. This wasn't about an affair. This was a strategy. I opened another file. Email threads. Not long. Not messy. Efficient. The second Lauren appeared there. Not as a secret. Not as a hidden contact. But as a participant. Direct. Confident. Leading. Her messages weren't flirtatious. They were directives. Short instructions. Clear expectations. She didn't ask Andrew what to do. She told him. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes narrowing as I followed the thread. Andrew responded. Always. Sometimes quickly. Sometimes with slight hesitation. But always within the structure she set. He wasn't leading this. He was executing it. A quiet realization settled over me, heavier than anything I had felt so far. This wasn't an affair I had to survive. This was a system I had to understand. I clicked into another document. This one was different. Shorter. More direct. The file name made my chest tighten. My name. Not affectionate. Not personal. Categorized. I opened it. The words hit differently. Cold. Clinical. Risk factor. High visibility. Control required before Phase 2. I read it again. Slower this time. Forcing myself to absorb every detail. They weren't talking about me as a person. They were talking about me as a problem. A variable. An obstacle. My throat tightened. But I didn't look away. Instead, I kept reading. Steps. Outlined. Clear. Limit external communication. Introduce doubt in professional credibility. Create controlled instability. I sat back slowly. My mind racing, but my body still. This wasn't about removing me physically. It was about weakening me strategically. Breaking my position. Undermining my influence. I opened the next file. Timeline. Dates. 3 months ago. Exactly when everything began to change. Every shift in Andrew's behavior. Every late night. Every distance. Mapped. Not random. Designed. I pressed my lips together. A bitter clarity settling in. The coldness. The silence. The way he pulled away from me. It wasn't because he stopped caring. It was because he had already moved on to the next phase. I went back to the emails. Scrolled further. Watched the pattern. She directed. He followed. And then I saw it. A small delay. A hesitation in one of his responses. Subtle. But there, my eyes lingered on it. He wasn't completely in control. He wasn't completely certain. He was part of this, but not above it. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time since this started, the anger didn't come. Not the kind I expected. What replaced it was something else. Something sharper. More useful. Understanding. I closed the file with my name on it. The screen dimming slightly as I sat there in the quiet. They had built a plan. Layered. Structured. Carefully timed. And in that plan, I wasn't his wife. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't even a person. I was a liability. An obstacle to be removed. My fingers rested lightly on the edge of the laptop as a thought formed. Clear and steady, this wasn't something I could confront. It wasn't something I could argue. It wasn't even something I could expose, not yet. Because right now, I was still inside it. And if I made the wrong move, I wouldn't just lose him. I would lose everything they were already preparing to take from me. I closed the laptop slowly, the soft click echoing in the silence. And for the first time since I saw him in that restaurant, I didn't feel like I was reacting anymore. I felt like I was thinking, planning, adjusting, because this wasn't an affair I needed to survive. It was a strategy I needed to outplay. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind refused to slow down. Every document, every line, every calculated step replayed in quiet loops, sharpening instead of fading. By the time the first light slipped through the windows, I already knew one thing for certain. This wasn't something happening to me. It was something being done to me. I sat at the kitchen counter, Andrew's laptop open in front of me again, the file with my name pulled up for the second time. This time, I didn't skim. I studied every word, every phrase, every implication. Reputation destabilization, controlled exposure, credibility erosion. The language wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. They didn't need me gone. They needed me discredited. My jaw tightened slightly as I scrolled further. Step 1. Introduce uncertainty. Step 2. Create doubt through indirect channels. Step 3. Force compliance under pressure. I leaned back slowly, the realization settling deeper. This wasn't about money alone. It was about control. If my reputation collapsed, everything else followed. My work, my influence, my voice, and then whatever they needed from me, I would sign. Not because I wanted to, because I would have no other option. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it press in. Then I opened them again. Calm, focused. If this had already started, then there would be signs. I reached for my phone and opened my email. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. A message from a long-term client. Short, polite, but distant. Hey, Lauren. Just wanted to circle back on a few concerns that came up recently. Concerns. That word didn't belong there. I opened the thread, reading carefully. The tone wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't trusting either. Something had shifted. I scrolled further down my inbox. Another message. Another subtle change. A partnership request suddenly paused. No explanation. No urgency. Just distance. I set the phone down slowly, my fingers resting against the screen. It had already begun. They weren't preparing to attack. They were already doing it. Quietly. Gradually, I stood up, pacing once across the kitchen before stopping again. This wasn't chaos. It was a timeline, and I was right in the middle of it. The sound of movement behind me pulled my attention back. Andrew. He stepped into the kitchen, still half asleep, running a hand through his hair. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied, my tone light. Easy. He moved toward the counter, reaching for a glass. I watched him carefully this time, not as a wife, as an observer. He poured water, took a sip, then set the glass down. His movements were controlled, but not perfectly. There was a slight pause, a fraction of a second longer than necessary. His eyes flicked toward me, studying my face, not casually, carefully. He was checking for something. Everything okay? He asked. I smiled. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? His gaze lingered for a moment. Then he nodded. Just checking. Just checking. I held his gaze a second longer, then looked away first. Deliberately. Letting him believe what he wanted to believe. Letting him think I was still where he left me. Unaware. Unprepared. I turned back to the counter, picking up my coffee like nothing had changed. But inside, everything had... He wasn't just lying. He was monitoring, watching for signs, adjusting based on my reactions, which meant one thing. If I reacted, they would accelerate. The thought settled into place with quiet certainty. I couldn't make a move yet. Not until I understood their timing. Not until I knew exactly how far they had already gone. Busy day. he asked, leaning slightly against the counter. Always, I said with a soft laugh. He smiled. Relaxed again. Comfortable? That confidence told me more than anything else. He believed the plan was working, which meant I had an advantage. For now. He finished his drink and stepped away, grabbing his jacket. I might be late again tonight, he said. Of course you will, I replied lightly. He didn't catch it. Or maybe he didn't think he needed to. He leaned in, brushing a quick kiss against my cheek. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click. I didn't move for a few seconds. Just stood there, listening to the silence settle back into place. Then I exhaled slowly. They're already moving, I whispered to myself. And I needed to move smarter, not faster. Smarter. I walked back to the table, opening my laptop again. This time, I wasn't searching blindly. I wasn't reacting to what I found. I was thinking like them. If I wanted to dismantle this, I needed to understand how they expected me to behave. Panic. Confront. Collapse. That was their script. So I would give them something else. I would stay calm. I would stay quiet. I would stay exactly where they thought I was. Until I wasn't. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as a new thought formed, sharper than the rest. I wasn't just inside their plan. I was the center of it. And if I played this wrong, I wouldn't just lose my marriage. I would lose everything they had already started to take from me. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faint in the dark screen. And for the first time since this began, I understood the real danger. I wasn't being replaced. I was being erased. The email arrived at 9:13 in the morning. Short, polite, neutral. Lauren, we'd like to have you join a brief meeting today regarding some recent concerns. Please confirm availability. No details. No urgency in tone. But everything about it felt urgent. I read it twice. Then a third time. Not for what it said, but for what it didn't. This wasn't a meeting. It was a setup. I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a simple reply. Of course. I'll be there. I didn't ask questions. I didn't push back. Because if they expected resistance, I wasn't going to give it to them. By the time I arrived at the office, I already knew what this was going to be. Not a conversation. An evaluation. The conference room was colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in tone. Glass walls. Clean lines. Too much light. The kind of space designed to make everything visible while hiding the intent behind it. There were already people seated when I walked in. Executives. 2 from our side. 3 I recognized from the partner company. And Andrew. He sat near the center of the table. Posture relaxed. Expression neutral. When he saw me, he gave a small, reassuring smile. The kind that used to mean something. Now it just felt rehearsed. Lauren, one of the executives said, gesturing toward an empty chair. Thanks for coming on such short notice. Of course, I replied, taking my seat. My tone was calm, measured. Exactly what they expected from me. Or maybe exactly what they didn't. I folded my hands lightly on the table and waited. No one spoke immediately. That was the first signal. They were waiting for me to fill the silence. To get uncomfortable. To say something that could be used. I didn't. Finally, one of the partner executives leaned forward slightly. We've had a few concerns raised recently, he began, his voice careful. Nothing definitive, but enough that we thought it was worth discussing. Concerns. The same word from the emails. I nodded once. Of course, I said. What kind of concerns? He exchanged a brief glance with another executive before continuing. Some inconsistencies in communication. A few questions about information flow. Just small things. Small things. I kept my expression neutral. Can you be more specific? I asked. Before he could answer, Andrew spoke. Nothing serious? He said quickly. Just things we want to clarify before moving forward? I turned my head slightly toward him. Our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Not guilt. Not fear. Control. He wasn't defending me. He was guiding the conversation. Shaping it. I looked back at the executive. "I'm happy to clarify anything," I said. And I meant it. Just not in the way they expected. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn right away. I didn't need to. I already knew who it was. The second Lauren. She stepped into the room like she belonged there. Not hesitant. Not unsure. Confident in a way that wasn't loud, but unmistakable. "Sorry, I'm late," she said, taking a seat across from me. No acknowledgement. No hesitation. Just professionalism. "Lauren Carter," one of the executives said, gesturing toward her. "This is Lauren Hayes. She's been consulting with us on the transition strategy." Transition. The word landed quietly. I nodded once. "Nice to meet you," I said. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary. "You too," she replied. Her tone was smooth, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something calculating. The meeting resumed. Or rather, it began. Lauren Hayes opened a folder in front of her, glancing briefly at the documents before speaking. "We've been reviewing communication patterns over the past few months," she said. "And there are a few areas where alignment hasn't been consistent." Her voice was calm, neutral, but every word was placed with precision. She wasn't accusing. She was framing. I listened without interrupting. She referenced emails, timing gaps, moments where information had been delayed or interpreted differently. None of it was direct. None of it was clear. But together, it created a shape, a narrative, one where I was unreliable, unstable, a risk. I felt the weight of the room shift slightly. Subtle, but real. "They're just observations," Andrew added, his tone careful. "Nothing we can't resolve." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. He wasn't protecting me. He was softening the ground beneath me, making the fall look reasonable. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. "Can I ask something?" I said. The room stilled. "Of course," one of the executives replied. "Are these concerns based on actual outcomes?" I asked calmly. "Or on how those outcomes are being interpreted?" A small pause. Lauren Hayes met my eyes. "Interpretation matters," she said. "It does," I agreed. "But so does accuracy." Silence again. This time, it felt different. Less controlled. More uncertain. I didn't push further. I didn't need to, because this wasn't the moment to win. It was the moment to observe. To confirm. To understand the structure they were building around me. And it was all there. Every question pre-planned. Every response anticipated. Every conclusion already waiting. This wasn't a meeting about solving a problem. It was a meeting about justifying one. I leaned back slightly, letting my posture relax again, letting them believe I was still inside the narrative they had built, still reacting, still unaware. But inside, everything had shifted, because now I could see it clearly. The positioning, the framing, the slow removal of ground beneath my feet. I glanced at the screen at the far end of the room. A slide flashed briefly before changing. But it was enough. A timeline. A transition. My role, absent. My name, gone. I looked back at the table, my expression unchanged. And that was when the final piece settled into place. This meeting was never about saving my position. It was about erasing me from it. I felt her before I saw her. Not in some dramatic way. Just a shift. A reflection in the glass storefront beside me that didn't belong to the rhythm of the street. I kept walking. Didn't turn. Didn't slow down. But I watched her in the reflection. Same posture. Same calm presence. The stranger. I stopped at the corner, pretending to check my phone. The city moved around me, cars, voices, footsteps, but everything inside me narrowed to a single point. I turned. She was standing a few feet behind me. Not hiding. Not pretending. Just there. You're easy to follow, I said quietly. A faint smile touched her lips. You're easy to predict. I slipped my phone back into my bag. My pulse steady now. You've been following me, I said. Not you, she replied. Them, I held her gaze. And I'm part of them. Her expression shifted slightly. No, she said. You're part of what they're building. That landed differently. I studied her for a moment, weighing the options. Walk away. Ignore her. Pretend none of this mattered. But that wasn't who I was anymore. What do you want? I asked. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to keep it between us. To show you what you're actually inside. The words were calm, certain. I hesitated for half a second. Then I nodded once. We moved without speaking, crossing the street and slipping into a quieter side block. Less traffic, less noise, more space to think. She stopped near a glass wall overlooking the river, turning to face me fully for the first time. Up close, she looked even more composed, not detached, controlled. I've been watching Andrew's company for months, she said. No build-up, no hesitation, just the truth. I crossed my arms slowly. Why? Because it doesn't operate the way it claims to. That matched what I had already started to see. Go on, I said. They're restructuring assets, she continued. Moving influence. Cleaning public perception before a major transition. My jaw tightened slightly. And where do I fit into that? Her eyes didn't leave mine. You're the credibility layer, she said. I let out a quiet breath. Meaning, your reputation makes everything they're doing look legitimate. The words settled into place with uncomfortable precision. My work, my clients, my image, all of it. They didn't just marry you, she added. They positioned you. I looked away for a moment, out at the water, letting the weight of that sink in. Then I looked back. And you know all this because... She reached into her coat and pulled out a thin folder. Not thick. Not overwhelming. Curated. She handed it to me. I didn't take it right away. Who are you? I asked again. This time, she didn't avoid the question. I work with people who clean up after situations like this, she said. That wasn't a real answer, but it was enough. I took the folder. Opened it. Inside. Everything was clean. Organized. Selected. Transaction patterns. Internal memos. Names. Connections. I flipped through the pages slowly, my eyes scanning, my mind already building links. Andrew, his company, external investors, and her, Lauren. Everywhere. Not hidden. Integrated. She wasn't on the outside of this. She was in the center of it. She's not just involved, I said quietly. No, the stranger replied. She's driving it. I closed the folder halfway, my grip tightening slightly. That doesn't make sense, I said. Andrew is useful, she interrupted. Not in control. The words hit harder than I expected, because I had already started to suspect it. Now it was confirmed. I flipped another page. A timeline. Not identical to the one I saw earlier. More complete. More detailed. They've done this before, she said. I looked up sharply. What? Not the exact same structure, she clarified. But the pattern is consistent. Insert. Leverage. Remove. Exit. I stared at the page, my thoughts moving faster now. And the people before me? I asked. She didn't answer right away. That told me everything. They didn't see it in time, she said finally. A quiet silence stretched between us. The city noise felt distant again. Muted. How do you know I will? I asked. Her gaze sharpened slightly. Because you didn't walk over there last night, she said. You sat down. I held her eyes. And now you have a choice, she said. I glanced down at the folder again, then back at her. What kind of choice? You can try to survive this, she said. Or you can take control of it. My fingers tightened around the edge of the pages. And you? I can't go inside, she said. You already are. There it was. The missing piece. You need me, I said. I need access, she corrected. You need leverage. I almost smiled. Almost. Because for the first time since this started, the balance shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. What happens if I say no? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Then you'll lose everything they're already taking from you, she said. And you won't even understand how... I let that sit. Not because I doubted her. Because I knew she was right. I closed the folder slowly. My reflection faint in the glass beside us. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Not the one from yesterday. This one was sharper. Colder. Aware. They think they're writing the story, I said quietly. Her expression didn't change. They always do, she replied. I looked up, meeting her gaze one last time. Then let's make sure they don't get to finish it. She nodded once. Not satisfied. Not relieved. Just ready. And as we stood there, the city moving around us, I realized something that hadn't been clear before. I wasn't alone anymore. And more importantly, I wasn't just reacting. I was about to start playing. The next morning, I stopped reacting. Not because there was nothing left to feel, but because feeling was no longer useful. If they were building a story around me, shaping it piece by piece until it looked like truth, then the only way out was to build a better one. I sat at my desk, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop before turning it on. For years, I had done this for other people. Crisis control, narrative correction, reputation management. Now, I was the crisis, and I was going to manage it. The first thing I did was disappear. Not physically, digitally. I stopped replying to anything that didn't require a response. No unnecessary emails. No quick reactions. No emotional replies. Every word I sent from that moment forward had a purpose. If they were watching, and I knew they were, I wasn't going to give them anything they could use. Then I started collecting. Not aggressively, not recklessly. Quietly. Andrew talked more when he thought I wasn't listening. Small things. Passing comments. Fragments that didn't mean much on their own. But together, they formed patterns. I recorded what I could. Saved what mattered. Ignored what didn't. Every conversation became data. Every pause. Every hesitation. Every shift in tone, evidence. At night, when he thought I was asleep, I listened to him move through the apartment. The soft glow of his phone lighting up the dark. The low murmur of conversations he kept just out of reach. I didn't confront him. I didn't even react. Because the more comfortable he felt, the more he revealed, and he was getting comfortable. That was the mistake. A few days later, he mentioned a meeting in passing. Big week coming up, he said, scrolling through his phone. A lot of moving parts. I nodded, pretending to focus on my own screen. Sounds intense. He smirked slightly. It's worth it. Worth it. The words lingered longer than they should have. I glanced at him briefly, then looked away, letting the moment pass. But inside, something shifted. He believed in this. Not just the outcome. The process. That made him predictable. And predictability was something I could use. I started feeding the narrative back. Subtle changes. Nothing obvious. I became just distracted enough. Missed a detail here. Delayed a response there. Let my tone slip slightly in conversations that didn't matter. Not enough to raise alarm. Just enough to confirm their expectations. If they wanted to see instability, I would let them. Controlled. Measured. Intentional. Andrew noticed. Of course he did. You okay? He asked one night, watching me a little too closely. I looked up from my phone, blinking like I had just been pulled out of a thought. Yeah, I said softly. Just tired. He studied me for a second, then nodded. "Work's been a lot," he said. I let out a quiet breath. "Yeah, it has." He relaxed after that. Just slightly, but I saw it. That shift, that confidence. He thought the plan was working, which meant I was ahead. I reached out to a few old contacts next, carefully, not to ask for help, to remind them I existed. A quick check-in here, a casual update there. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Everything that would reinforce my position. Reputation wasn't something you rebuilt overnight, but it could be reinforced quietly, layer by layer. At the same time, I kept feeding information to her. The stranger, I still didn't know her real name, but she didn't need one. We communicated in fragments. Secure. Minimal. I gave her what I could confirm. Dates. Conversations. Access points. In return, she filled in the gaps. The structure became clearer with every exchange. Andrew's company wasn't just shifting assets. They were repositioning influence, preparing for something bigger. And the second Lauren, she was at the center of it. But something else started to stand out. A gap. Small, but consistent. Timing mismatches between Andrew's actions and hers. Moments where he seemed uncertain, delayed, like he was waiting for direction. I leaned back in my chair one afternoon, staring at the ceiling as the thought settled into place. He wasn't leading. He was following. The realization didn't shock me. It clarified everything. His confidence, his hesitation, the way he moved, controlled, but not fully in control. He wasn't the architect. He was part of the design. That changed the game. Because if he wasn't the one calling the shots, then the real power was somewhere else. And power always left a trail. I turned back to my laptop, opening the timeline I had been building. Every piece, every connection, every movement. It wasn't complete, but it was enough. Enough to see the shape of it. Enough to understand where to push. I closed the file slowly, my fingers resting on the keyboard. This wasn't about catching him anymore. It wasn't even about exposing him. It was about collapsing the structure around him. And to do that, I needed the right moment, the right place, the right audience. I picked up my phone, scrolling through upcoming events, and there it was. The launch. High profile, public. Exactly the kind of stage they would want. Exactly the kind of stage I needed. A slow smile touched my lips. Barely there. For the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I was planning my own. Because they thought they understood the narrative. They thought they knew how this would end. But they were wrong. They had been writing a story about me. And now, I was about to rewrite theirs. I stopped looking at Andrew as the problem. That was the first real shift. Up until that moment, everything had been framed around him, his lies, his distance, his betrayal. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became. He wasn't the center. He was a piece. I sat at my desk late that night. The city outside reduced to a blur of light and movement. My laptop open in front of me. Files. Timelines. Notes. Everything I had gathered was spread across the screen like fragments of something that finally made sense. I reopened the email threads, not to read them again, to study them, line by line, pattern by pattern. Andrew's messages were consistent, measured, responsive, sometimes slightly hesitant. The second Lauren's messages were different, shorter, more direct. She didn't ask questions. She issued instructions. I zoomed in on a single exchange. Andrew, we may need to adjust the timeline slightly. Her reply came minutes later. No. Stay on schedule. We can't afford deviation at this stage. No explanation. No discussion. Just control. I leaned back slowly, my fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk. He wasn't leading this. He was following orders. The realization didn't come with shock. It came with clarity. I opened another file. More threads. More patterns. Every key decision traced back to her. Every shift. Every adjustment. Every move. Andrew executed. She directed. I exhaled quietly, letting the truth settle in. This wasn't a partnership. It was a hierarchy. And Andrew, he wasn't at the top. I closed the file and opened the timeline I had been building. Now, I adjusted it, reframed it, moved him down, moved her up. Everything aligned better that way. Cleaner, more accurate. My phone buzzed softly beside me. A message from her. The stranger. Have you seen it yet? I typed back without hesitation. Yes. A pause. Then, you understand what that means? I stared at the screen for a second before replying. He's not in control. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, no, he never was. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the window. So what is he? I typed. The reply came quickly. Access. The word settled heavily. Access? Not partner? Not leader. A door. A way in. I closed my eyes for a moment. Piecing it together. Andrew had something they needed. Position. Proximity. Trust. And once they had what they needed, he would be just as disposable as I was. I opened my eyes again. Sharper now. And her? I asked. There was a longer delay this time. Then, she's done this before. I straightened slightly. What do you mean? Different companies. Different structures. Same pattern. Insert. Leverage. Remove. Exit. My jaw tightened. She builds trust. The message continued. Then she controls the narrative. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's already over. I stared at the screen, the weight of it pressing in. And no one stopped her. I asked. No one inside. That made sense. Because from the inside, it didn't look like an attack. It looked like transition. Improvement. Strategy. Until it was too late. I placed my phone down slowly, my mind already moving ahead. If she had done this before, then she wasn't just confident. She was experienced. And that meant she would expect resistance. Eventually, but not yet. Not from me. Not from the version of me she believed she was dealing with. I stood up and walked toward the window, the city stretching out below me. Somewhere out there, she was moving, planning, adjusting, just like I was. The difference was, she didn't know I had seen her. Not fully, not clearly, and that was my advantage. I turned back toward the desk, my thoughts narrowing into something precise. This wasn't about exposing Andrew anymore. That would be too small, too limited. This was about exposing the structure, the system, the pattern she had built. And to do that, I needed more than evidence. I needed a stage, a moment where everything converged, where the right people were watching, where the narrative couldn't be contained. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through the upcoming calendar. The launch event, high profile, public, exactly the kind of setting she would use to finalize everything. Exactly the kind of setting I could use to break it. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I typed, when. The reply came almost instantly. Soon. I smiled faintly. Not because it was reassuring, because it confirmed what I already knew. They were close, which meant I had to be closer. I set the phone down and opened a new file on my laptop. Not for notes, not for evidence, for planning, step by step, layer by layer. What to reveal, when to reveal it, how to control the room, how to control the narrative. Because this wasn't just about truth, it was about timing. And if I got that right, I wouldn't just expose them. I would dismantle everything they had built. I paused, my fingers still above the keyboard, and let one final thought settle into place. I wasn't preparing to confront my husband. I was preparing to expose the woman who had been controlling him all along. And this time, she wouldn't see it coming. I arrived before they did. That was the first move. The venue was already glowing when I stepped inside, glass walls reflecting the city lights, soft music floating through the air. Conversations layered over the quiet hum of something expensive and controlled. It looked like success. It smelled like it too. Champagne, polished wood, carefully curated confidence. I walked in like I belonged there. Because I did. Every detail of this night had been built on the kind of reputation I spent years creating. The kind of trust they had tried to turn into leverage. And now, it was my stage. I moved through the room slowly, greeting familiar faces, letting them see me, not shaken, not uncertain. Present, steady. That mattered. Perception always came first. Andrew arrived 20 minutes later. I saw him before he saw me. Same posture, same control, same version of himself he had been performing for weeks now. But tonight, something was different. There was tension in the way he scanned the room. Subtle. But there, he wasn't as comfortable as he wanted to appear. Good. That meant the pressure was already there. The second Lauren entered shortly after. She didn't look for Andrew. She looked at the room, evaluating, positioning. When her eyes finally landed on me, she paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she smiled. Polite, professional, calculated, like we were strangers. I held her gaze, didn't smile back, didn't react, just acknowledged. Then I looked away first. Control. The event began as expected. Speeches, introductions, carefully structured excitement about growth, expansion, the future. Words designed to create momentum, to shape belief. I stood near the edge of the main floor, listening without really listening, my focus shifting between them. Andrew moved like he belonged to the narrative. She moved like she owned it. That difference mattered. When the time came, it happened naturally. Or at least, it looked that way. One of the executives gestured toward me during a transition. Lauren, maybe you'd like to say a few words. There it was. The opening. I stepped forward without hesitation. No pause. No visible shift. Just movement. The room quieted slightly as I took the microphone. Faces turned. Attention focused. Perfect. I let a second pass before speaking. Not too long. Just enough. Thank you, I said. My voice calm. Clear. I wasn't planning to speak tonight. A few light smiles. A ripple of polite laughter. Good. They say moments like this are about celebrating progress. I continued. Growth. Alignment. I let the words settle. Trust. That one landed differently. I saw it. Small shifts in posture. Subtle changes in expression. I kept going. But in my experience, trust isn't built on what we say in rooms like this. I glanced briefly toward Andrew. Then toward her. It's built on what happens behind them. Silence. Not complete. But enough. Enough to feel the shift. Andrew straightened slightly. She didn't move. Over the past few months, I said, I've had the opportunity to observe how this company operates. Not just externally. I paused. But internally, now the room was fully still. No laughter. No movement. Just attention. Controlled. Focused. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Patterns. I continued softly. Timelines. Decisions that don't quite align with the story being presented. I saw the first exchange of glances between executives. Confusion. Uncertainty. Andrew stepped forward slightly. Lauren, I didn't look at him. Not yet. Transparency matters, I said. My tone steady, especially when people's reputations are being used as part of the process. That word hung in the air. Used. I let it sit. Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a folder. Not thick, not overwhelming, just enough. I won't take much of your time, I said. But I think it's important that we all understand what's actually happening here. I placed the folder on the podium, opened it. Internal communications, I said. Timeline correlations. Structured narrative adjustments. Each phrase landed like a weight. Measured. Precise. Andrew spoke again. Sharper this time. Lauren, this isn't the place. Now I looked at him. Finally. No, I said calmly. It's exactly the place. The room shifted again. Pressure building. She stepped forward then. Smooth. Controlled. Lauren, she said. Her tone still professional. If you have concerns, we can address them privately. I met her gaze. No, I repeated. We can't. A flicker. Small. But there. This wasn't private. I continued. So neither is this. I lifted one of the documents. Reputation destabilization. I read controlled exposure. Credibility erosion. Murmurs. Low. Uneasy. I didn't rush. I didn't overwhelm. I let each piece land before moving to the next. Coordinated communication between internal and external parties. I glanced at Andrew, then back at her. Directed timelines. Now the tension was visible. Andrew's composure cracked first. That's not what this is. It is, I said quietly. Not louder. Just firmer. And that was enough. Because now, the room was no longer listening to him. They were watching me. The narrative had shifted. Not completely, but enough. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. You don't understand what you're doing. I almost smiled. I understand exactly what I'm doing, I said. And for the first time that night, she hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because that was the moment everything turned. The moment the story they had built began to break. And once it started, there was no stopping it. The silence after everything collapsed was louder than anything that came before it. No music, no speeches, no carefully constructed narrative holding the room together. Just fragments, whispers, glances. The subtle, unmistakable shift of power moving from one side to another. I stepped back from the podium slowly. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just done. Andrew didn't follow me. He didn't say my name again. He didn't try to fix it. Because there was nothing left to fix. I could see it in his face now, clearly. Without the layer of control he had worn so carefully for months. Confusion. Not about what had happened. About how it had happened. He had believed the structure was solid. That once it was in place, it couldn't be challenged. He was wrong. The second Lauren recovered faster. Of course she did. She stepped forward, attempting to reframe the situation. Her voice smooth, composed, as if she could still guide the outcome back into something manageable. But the room had already moved past her. Once doubt enters a space like that, it doesn't leave. It multiplies. Executives were no longer listening. They were questioning, looking at each other, looking at the documents, looking at her, and that was enough. I didn't stay to watch the rest unfold. I didn't need to, because I knew what would happen next. Investigations, internal reviews, decisions made behind closed doors. The kind of quiet consequences that dismantle everything without needing another word. I walked out into the night alone. The same city. The same lights. The same streets I had stood on just days ago. Thinking everything in my life was about to fall apart. But it felt different now. Not lighter. Not easier. Just clearer. I stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, letting the air settle around me. For the first time since this began, I wasn't replaying anything. Not the kiss. Not the lies. Not the plan. Because none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was what I had seen. And what I had done with it. My phone buzzed softly in my hand. A message. Unknown number. You did what no one else could. I stared at it for a second. Then typed back. No. I just saw it in time. There was no reply. I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept walking. The days that followed unfolded exactly the way I expected. Quietly. Deliberately. Andrew was removed from his position within a week. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Just gone. The kind of exit that leaves more questions than answers. The second Lauren didn't disappear. Not immediately. But the shift was visible. Meetings canceled. Partnerships paused. People distancing themselves in ways that didn't need to be explained. The investigation moved forward without noise. But I could feel it. In the calls I received. In the way people spoke to me again. Carefully. Respectfully. As if something had been restored. Or maybe revealed. I returned to my work slowly. Not because I needed time. But because I chose to, for the first time in a long time. I wasn't reacting to what someone else had built around me. I was choosing what to build next. And that changed everything. One evening, I found myself back in the same part of the city. Not the same restaurant, but close enough to remember. I stopped outside, watching people move in and out, laughter spilling into the night, conversations overlapping in that familiar way. For a moment, I saw myself there, sitting alone, smiling at a message that wasn't real, waiting for something that had already ended. And I felt nothing. Not anger. Not sadness. Just distance. Because that version of me didn't understand what I understand now. That betrayal doesn't begin with a kiss. It begins with a shift in power. With someone deciding they can rewrite your place in their story without you noticing. And the truth is, they almost did. I turned away from the restaurant and kept walking. Not because I was avoiding it. Because I didn't need it anymore. I had already closed that chapter. And for the first time since everything began, I understood something I hadn't before. I was never the victim. I was the one who chose when the story ended. I was the one who decided what came next. And that kind of control? You don't lose it once you've found it. I paused at the corner, the city stretching out in front of me, full of stories I didn't know yet. Then I smiled. Just slightly. Because now I did. If you've ever been in a moment where everything felt like it was slipping out of your control, I want to know, would you have reacted? Or would you have waited? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that sometimes the strongest move isn't the loudest one, stay with me. There's always more beneath the surface. And the next story might feel closer than you think. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.